And a very good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to a Lyceum evening coming to you from the Paul Spiritualist Church down on the south coast of the UK. Very pleased to welcome our guest tonight. We have Dr. Michael Dorr from the University of Northampton, and he is with us to share some of his findings and his research into the effects of diet and psychism, which will obviously also affect our mediumship as well. So, Michael, good evening. Welcome, sir.
Hello, yes, and thank you for asking me. Yes, and hello, everyone who's there.
Yeah, people will gradually come on. So, Michael, how did this field of research come about? What was the prompt there? What was the thinking of, I need to know that?
I think I've always been interested in, I've been interested in both parapsychology, in sort of psychic stuff, I suppose, and mediumship and things like that all my life. And I've also been interested in food, both as a consumer, but also in the sort of nutritional sense, and these days in the sort of political and environmental sense as well. So, the impact of food on our environment, the impact of food on our world, indeed the impact of our food choices on animals and the beings we share our planet with.
Interesting. Ooh, this is going to be good. I'm enjoying this. Many years ago, when I was first out developing with what we lovingly call the old school mediums, it was always very much a thing that when you've worked either psychically or mediumistically, you always have something sweet. Now, this came about because I do not know who instigated the trial, if it was a proper trial or just somebody trying something. But the mediums, before they worked, they would have their blood sugars measured. And then they would have their blood sugars measured after they worked. And I'm told that in each case, there was quite a significant drop in the blood sugars. This is how the old thing came about of doing a den. You always get a cup of tea and a biscuit afterwards. It was not just courtesy, it served a function.
Yeah. I'm not very familiar with what mediums do and so on. Is it worth talking about some of the research I've done?
Yes, please.
I suppose it's worth talking about a little bit of the background, I suppose. And because I was I was particularly interested in the impact of vegetarianism, abstaining from meat and veganism, abstaining from dairy, on the impact of being psychic and so on. And I think I was thinking of things like the Indian philosophies, the Indian traditions, where vegetarianism is quite widespread, and their connections with, and also what's also a kind of obvious link with Indian traditions is things like the siddhis, the sort of superpowers that are said to manifest by through yoga, the practice of yoga. And so that got me interested really in the link between the diet and these kind of superpowers, and to see whether there was kind of a link. And no one's really, before I started, no one's really looked into this connection, particularly with eating animal products and with the sort of psychic type things. And I'd suggested this idea for a project to Professor Chris Rowe and Dr. Callum Cooper at the University of Northampton. I suggested to do a PhD in it, and they were kind of quite intrigued. I think they hadn't really thought about that. But although they had kind of come across the idea of fasting. So, so the idea that particularly, say, shamans who are in the, from indigenous societies, who before they wanted to manifest, go into a trance and do kind of these supernormal things, that they would fast for a period of time beforehand. And so it was really that kind of connection that I was interested in pursuing, really, and interested in doing some experimentation, doing some surveys, and seeing whether that link really was a real one, or whether it was just kind of mythology, I suppose.
Yeah, very good. again, just going back, talking from personal experience, when I first started to work publicly on a platform, be it mediumistically or psychically, I would not eat on the day of when I was working. Well, an awful lot of our platforms and events are in the evening. So I would go through the whole day and I would abstain from any food. The trouble is, after the event, you are then ravenous, and then you are eating the stuff that you shouldn't eat at the wrong time of the day as well. So that had an effect that I had to manage. But then I switched to a very light diet of couscous, because I was talking to somebody and they said, well, when you're working with spirit, when you're working with the psychic, you're using energy. And if you're not building the fire, if you're not giving enough to burn, then that may affect your abilities. And I thought, that's interesting. But I've seen the converse, where people have gone out and, it's in our culture, isn't it? It's in our national identity, the Sunday roast, the childhood memories of Sunday dinner with everybody around the table. And then everybody falls asleep because the human body needs that time to process and digest this sudden influx of heavy nutrition. So, with our demonstrating and with our working with our psychic and our mediumship faculties, there is that area that we don't tend to look at too much of, should we eat? If we do, what do we eat? Do we not eat? Do we And I think a lot of that's going to be down to personal interpretation and also trial and error as well, obviously.
Yeah, and that's a good point about trial and error, because I, as the first sort of project I did for my PhD, I interviewed people who were kind of, shall we say, professional psychics. So by the way, the word psychic I'm using in its kind of broadest sense. So anyone who kind of practices what you and your community practice in terms of mediumship, but also other things like channeling, perhaps even just sort of using it, sort of mental powers to do other things. And I interviewed. It turned out that I was sort of interested in interviewing people who thought that diet was important to what they did, and I ended up interviewing, I think, 3 or 4 mediums, professional mediums. At least one of those was a spiritualist medium, Ross Bartlett, and he talked about how it was through a process of trial and error. Really, he found that if he went to do a demonstration or a reading, then, and if he'd eaten beforehand, it just didn't go as well as it would if he'd not eaten. So he very much abstained from eating for food for quite a substantial time before. So to the extent that he kind of fasted beforehand. But he also found that I think he was vegetarian anyway, and he said he was partly vegetarian because he would sometimes connect with people's pets or so on, or sort of pet rabbit who'd passed on, and he kind of said, well, if it kind of didn't sit well with him to be connecting with an animal that he might have eaten their relatives, if you like. So he kind of thought that's why he was vegetarian. But then he also went vegan from being vegetarian. So he started abstaining from eating all animal products. And he noticed what he felt like was a much clearer connection to spirit. And that's kind of what he reported. He reported quite a significant, improvement. Now, I know that's not uniform, that not everyone reports that, but nevertheless, and in fact I sought out people who said that it did make a difference, but because I was interested in finding out what worked for them, how it worked, what was important for them. So it's just kind of interesting that link between diet and their practice is kind of seen as important to many people.
Excuse me. Very true. And like probably many other people over the last certainly 2 years, although my diet was meat probably once or twice a week and that was it, I found myself drifting more and more away from meat, but also being very conscious of what I'm actually eating. I'm one of these boring people now in the supermarkets that looks at the ingredients list. I had bowel cancer back in 2000, a lot of surgery. and I was finding issues after that, which affected me physically, mentally, emotionally. And when I started to eat cleaner in my food, so Jason's, I'll plug a bread, Jason's sourdough has flour, yeast and salt in it, and that's it, and water. When you eat cleaner and when you're more conscious of what you're putting into your body, actually the physical conditions that I've been suffering from have alleviated a great deal, which obviously has a knock-on effect in my life. And when you do drift off the path, I've just recently had some guests over from America, and we're drinking Coke for breakfast and things like that. And when you do drift off that path, the effect is really pronounced. It's not until you experience that benefit, then when you drift back, and boredom eating is my worst enemy. And if I eat something and I'm thinking I shouldn't be eating this, and the next day I'm thinking I wish I'd never eaten that, you actually really begin to appreciate how important this cycle is of nutrition and health.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the case that, I mean, you mentioned, drinking Coke, if people have a lot of sugar and a lot of fat and a lot of, what junk food type in its sort of wider sense, then I think it does cloud the mind, and it clouds judgment as well. And it's kind of ends up being a bit of a vicious circle as well. I think people forget to listen. They forget how to hear their body, what their body's saying to them about good food and pure food. And it means that it's even more difficult, if you like. Plus, because of a lot of these foods with so much sugar and fat, they're very addictive. So people kind of get into a bit of a vicious circle, really. And so it's very good to break out of that, like you have, with sort of clean eating and so on. And I don't think it's boring at all to be looking at the labels on food. I do it all the time. It is important to know what's going in your body, because it does affect us. And speaking personally, I was vegetarian for a number of years, but then I decided to go vegan, not for health reasons and not for spiritual reasons, but just because, well, kind of sort of for spiritual reasons, actually. Because I was concerned about the animal welfare and environmental factors. But what I found was that my mind, it seemed to be that dairy sort of clogged my mind. It clouded my mind, and my mind became a lot clearer. And actually not just my mind, but also things like my sinuses. And I've hardly had a cold or flu since I stopped having dairy. It's remarkable, really. And I know I'm not the only one to have done that. Now, that doesn't explicitly link to what we're talking about here in terms of the link between mediumship and other sort of psychic practices, if you like. But I mean, some of my participants think it does, that physical health is quite important for mental health, and mental health is quite important to kind of access these other realms, if you like, other dimensions, other states of consciousness, and so on. That it's all kind of linked together. We are a whole body, mind, and soul, and spirit, and that what you put into one of those affects the others as well. So, I don't know whether this is true, but equally, having impure thoughts or negative thoughts may impact the body and may impact the mind, and so on. So, these things are all related.
Very, very much so. I've recently had an experience where I've just seen without going too deep, the nasty underbelly of the spiritualist movement with certain people and comment. And these are people that will be out there working on platforms. And I'm going, the psychology of mediumship would make a very interesting discussion. To sit there and say one thing here and then go out and go, here I am, aren't I wonderful? And you're just like, really? How does that equate then? How do we do that? It is a wholeness in healing. You say in there about affecting the different bodies. In healing, when we're working on healing energy, we're working not just or only on the physical body, but it's the mental body, the emotional body, the spiritual body, the etheric body. And if any one of those is slightly out of line, if I've got deep emotional turmoil going on, if there's something there and it really is a presence in my emotional body, well, of course, that's going to echo out through all the other bodies, and the effect will be felt, and the effect will be manifest differently in each body. You know, somebody having a bad knee presenting physically with a bad knee, when you actually go into it, can be something rooted in the emotional body, and that is the response from it. So it goes a lot deeper. When we talk about the diet, we'll stick with the diet because, as I say, the psychology of mediumship is really good. That would be a very, very good talk. But the physicality of it all, and again, one of the basic laws and rules in spiritualism is balance. Now, you can take that down to its infinite level. And if you apply it to all your bodies, if all your bodies are in balance, then again, you mentioned like the cities earlier on, everything was in balance. Everything that could cause concern or whatever was not in their field. Their diet was just so. Their emotional state was so you got all the bodies virtually coming into this harmony. And that is when magic happens.
Yeah, I mean, I do. Yeah, I mean, it's not obviously it's not sufficient. You know, you obviously need to have. I don't know whether, I mean, you know far more than I do about what it takes to be a good medium, and it's just that from what I've heard, you know, anything that can help. So one of the other people I interviewed was Graham Nichols, who practices out of body experiences. So, and he's astral travel, you might call it, and he not only practices it himself, but he teaches it and he lectures and he writes about that as well. And he's of the mind that there's all sorts of things that you can do to support your practice, really, and that each one is not enough in its own to help to do it. But if you add all these different elements, you know, that they all contribute really to helping you leave your body, or getting your consciousness to leave your body if that's what you want to do. And so I think that is probably right. You know, it's probably the case that all these different things, and he was the one that actually kind of was partly the one who put me on the idea that it could be possible to experiment with this, and it could be possible to test whether being vegan or being vegan or vegetarian actually kind of helps you connect to your kind of psychic side of things, and to see whether that makes a difference, to see whether people who follow that kind of diet are perform better at with sort of psychic powers, if you like, psi as we call it.
I've seen many demonstrators. We're very fortunate here at Poole that we have a good influx of demonstrators, not only from the UK but from abroad as well. And actually a very high proportion of demonstrators that come and stay here, they are of vegetarian or vegan diets. Sometimes it is about the animal welfare and the husbandry and the food chain, but a lot of people just sort of drifted into it more so. There wasn't that conscious connection. I love what you said earlier about the gentleman, you know, bringing through pets and thinking, well, how can I bring through a pet if I might have eaten it? Sorry, yeah. I'm not laughing at that. I'm laughing with that because, yeah, one of the things that people should be taken from their spiritualism and their mediumistic and psychic experiences is the value of life. We append so much value on delivering the perfect message, but we actually need to take that back into ourselves and go, well, what does that say to me? What does that bring to me? And certainly life is just so precious, just so precious.
Yes, and I don't know whether, I don't know. I think a lot of people sort of compartmentalize, if you like. You know, people will say how much they love animals, and they'll have a dog and so on, and yet, of course, they eat meat. And it's that kind of saying, well, I love animals, but yet I'm happy to eat them, if you like, or they perhaps don't even think about what's gone on, the way that animal's been treated during its life, which is usually almost always miserable, and how it dies as well, which is almost always miserable as well. And then, some of my participants, when I was interviewing them, were saying that it was possible that that eating animals that have had such a sort of miserable existence, was, if you eat them, then you're kind of imbibing the kind of negative energies, if you like. And I'm sure you and many of your audience are familiar with Theosophical movement. The movement in the sort of Victorian era, really, that was kind of trying to put a philosophical basis to spiritualism, is how that they described it. And Annie Besant, who was the sort of second person to lead the organization, she was very much a committed sort of vegetarian, and she describes going to Chicago. I didn't know this, but Chicago apparently was kind of the center in America at the time, had a lot of slaughterhouses, a lot of meat processing and so on. And she said that just going into, as she traveled into Chicago, she could kind of feel the negative energy from all this kind of misery that was going on, and she felt that it was kind of pervading the astral plane, as she put it. And hence that's why in Theosophy they advised people to give up meat and not to eat meat. Equally, Edgar Cayce, who is, I think, a follower of Theosophy, but again, most people will be familiar with Edgar Cayce. Quite a few of his readings, as people came to him with their issues, or whether it was health issues, whatever, he would quite often recommend that they give up eating meat, to both purify the spirit and purify the body as well at the same time. Although I believe that's not sufficient. I mean, it's quite possible to give up meat and dairy and still have quite a lot of junk food. And that's not going to do you any good either. And indeed, the people I was interviewing were saying that is not. It isn't just sufficient to do that, to have a healthy body and a healthy mind. You do need to have a predominantly whole food diet. Have a balanced diet of with lots of different nutrients and so on and so forth. Fresh food, if possible. Lots of leafy green vegetables, as one of my participants was saying, was very important. She felt doing her channeling. So all these factors really seem to be important.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That really is fascinating. You're going on to a whole different level of thinking, which is wonderful. You talk about the Theosophic movement, which was Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if she put anything over, you wouldn't argue with her, because she was quite fearsome. But yeah, this is...
I think everyone looked fierce. I think it's the black and white photography. Maybe she wasn't really, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe she was a cuddly little lamb, but I don't know. I'm not going to tempt her. But yeah, there's so many things in our history which sadly today's world we either gloss over or we just pay lip service to. But there has always been this great amount of research into healthy living, healthy lifestyles, healthy eating. A lot of this work was already done. It was already put out there. It was already understood. It was, again, trial and error all the time of doing these things. And it just seems to have just disappeared a little bit, which is sad, But tell me, you have some slides to share with us tonight, do you not?
Well, I do. It was. I must admit, I misunderstood the format, so I didn't realise it would be a kind of like an interview format. I thought I was going to be giving a presentation, so I prepared a presentation. I mean, I'm quite happy. I will hand over with anything, which is why I just carried on. And indeed, I've talked about some of the things that are on those slides. I mean, they have more. I'll just tell you what's on them, and to see whether you really want to see them. They've got a lot more detail about my research. Which is a lot easier to explain, I think, with slides. I mean, if you like, I could kind of just flick through and point out some highlights.
That would be wonderful.
If you want to continue with this kind of format, or I can talk more. It's kind of up to you, really.
Okay. Yeah, if we could go to the slides, please, Mike, because you're investing this time and gathering all this energy, this evidence, and we do understand slides a lot more than we do sometimes spoken word. So
okay, I think you have to bring it up, don't you? I
do indeed. There we go, sir.
Yeah, so I won't go through it all because it's quite long apart from anything else. So I will say, so that is the focus of my research around the role of fasting and vegetarianism in spiritual and psychic phenomena. So some of this I've already talked about. I mean, this is some of the history that I've already mentioned about the connection really between religious traditions, spiritual traditions, and fasting and vegetarianism. This Rumi, the mystic, the Sufi poet, really talked a lot about fasting and had this poem called Fasting. Talked about there's a hidden sweetness in the stomach's emptiness, comparing our stomachs to a sound box, and if it's full of food, basically, then there's no music that can come from it, which I thought was quite a nice sort of poetic way of looking at things. I was just flicking through. I mentioned in terms of sort of mediumship and so on. Gladys Osborne Leonard, who is quite as again many people will be familiar with, probably better than mine. Was one of the mediums who's very thought that vegetarianism was very important, and direct quote from what she was saying in her autobiography. My mind is clear, as she says, I'm more open to direct spiritual guidance than I used to be from giving up eating food. She said, it seems as if the animals who love and are loved attain to spiritual rights and have an afterlife in the spiritual world just as we do. Helena Blavatsky, who aforementioned, yes, she does look quite stern on that, you're right. But that's where she said that if you really earnest students, she said, should avoid eating meat because it clogs and weights their brains and bodies and impairs their intuition, their inner faculties and powers. And I wanted to mention this actually particularly. So again, people might be aware of the Windbridge Research Centre and the Windbridge Research Institute. So this is a research centre in the US, and it focuses very much on experimental work with mediums. And it actually ran through a process of certifying mediums. So before they used mediums in their experimental research, they kind of validated them really to make sure that they were good. But what they noticed when they were working with mediums was that a lot of mediums seemed to have a lot of health issues. And they, I've mentioned a few there: autoimmune disease, bruising easily, headaches and migraines. So they thought, well, let's test this. Let's actually do a survey. So they surveyed 125 mediums and also 222 non-mediums just to sort of compare their respective health issues. And as you can see there, I've just picked out two things there perhaps related to diet. So gastrointestinal issues. 35% of mediums reported problems with their gut, basically, against 19% of non-mediums. And in terms of food tolerances, almost a third of mediums reported food intolerances compared to about 10% of non-mediums. Now, food very definitely wasn't a focus, and diet very much wasn't a focus of what their survey. It was really just about health issues. And they were really just confirming what they had seen and witnessed, that mediums tended to suffer more illness. So I think what I would like to do is actually extend upon this research, actually, and I haven't done it yet, but I want to put together a survey particularly focused on mediums to understand more about how mediums feel like their diet maybe impacts on their health and so on. So that's just mentioning that of sort of interest. So what I did for my PhD work, I did these three pieces of research, really. And I've talked a little bit about the interviews I did with professional psychics, but I also did a survey of people who fast and vegetarians and vegans to see whether, to see about their spiritual and psychic experiences, and also finally an experiment. So I will talk a little bit about these. I'm not going to go through all this. But I will quote some of the. So these are some of my participants. So Jess, she used channeling really to go on what she called divine missions, because she said that her voice was like a spirit guide. Used to ask her to do these kind of missions in service of various people, and she always used fasting before she did a sort of episode of channeling. And she said that it was like when she was doing running training or athletics. Before a race, you'd have this really tight period where you drill down, and we call it sharpening. It's like where you push yourself right to this peak edge, and that's sort of fasting for me. So this is what she was doing. She's explicitly using fasting to help with her kind of psychic practice. And a lot of these participants used to say, well, the reason why fasting helps is because it's providing clarity through a kind of purifying action. If you fast, you provide the opportunity for the body to let go of all the toxins and so on, and also the mind to let go of the toxins as well. So it kind of, as Graham, who's another participant who's into the out-of-body experience, says fasting is like a kind of reset, as a way to clear my mind. And Jamie, who's a medium, talked about there's less fog in my head after she fasts, so it's easier to connect to that subtle light energy. And then, as I said before, my participants also use vegetarianism. Ross, who I mentioned before, he noticed an increase in his ability to connect with the spirit world through being a vegan. And Jess also talked about how if she was being vegan, it helped her thoughts become a lot more stable and pure, if you like. So as I say, I'm not going to go through all this. Indeed, a lot of this is we've already talked about. But I also did some surveys. This was of the general population, so this wasn't of people who were particularly who said that they were particularly spiritual or particularly psychic. But I want to understand whether what diet people pursued or whether they fasted, whether that perhaps made a difference to the kinds of experiences they reported. So I asked them about their experiences and had basically a list of things, of different experiences. So for start, around sort of spiritual experiences, paranormal experiences. So for example, one of them was related to telepathy. So people would say, I know what others are feeling or thinking without them telling me. So people would either say yes or no to that. Do I have instances of telepathy or not? I seem to become aware of events before they happen. In other words, were they precognitive? Yes or no. Mm-hmm. And in terms of abilities, I'm able to communicate with the dead. Again, people would answer yes or no to that. I'm able to move or influence objects with the force of my mind alone. So, could they do mind over matter? And basically, after they'd answered all these questions, we could tot up and give them a kind of score, really. So kind of how psychic were they in terms of their experiences or in terms of their abilities. And most people would report very few of these, by the way. But nevertheless, what I wanted to see was, does diet make a difference to these scores? So, and this is what I found. So people who fasted reported more spiritual and paranormal experiences than people who didn't fast. People who reported fasting for longer, so for more than 3 days at a time, again reported more experiences and abilities than those who fasted for less time within the fasters. Vegetarians and vegans reported more spiritual paranormal experiences than meat eaters. And vegans reported more of those than vegetarians. In terms of whole foods, those who ate whole foods reported more of these experiences than those who ate fewer whole foods or had more junk food. People who were teetotal reported more experiences than people who drank alcohol. So we kind of got this, ended up being that basically the kind of like a recipe list of what can help you promote these kind of experiences. If you fast for longer, if you eat less meat and dairy, if you eat more whole foods, and if you avoid alcohol. And shall I just talk about my final experiment?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So the final experiment, which actually, well, anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute. But I thought, okay, so there's one thing to ask people about their experiences, but the trouble is when you ask people about their experiences, that's subject to kind of false memories or people forgetting or just getting things wrong, really, or thinking that they've had an instance of telepathy, and and wherein, as in fact, they kind of knew something and it was through a normal means, if you like. So a good way to sort that out is by running an experiment in controlled conditions. So I run a precognitive experiment. So actually get people into a room and see if they can see the future, which sounds kind of crazy. And I wanted to compare whether vegetarians and vegans did better than meat eaters. So what I did was, and I just quickly run through this procedure really, was tell the participant that they're going to see a photograph of a location in the future, but also tell them that location of that photograph, that the photograph is about. We don't know what it is yet. It hasn't been determined. So it's a kind of future event. And then we get them to enter a kind of sleepy state using what's known as a Ganzfeld. So it's kind of a red lighting and white noise and in a darkened room, because we're trying to simulate a kind of as if you're just going off to sleep, when you might have kind of spontaneous images and so on, because that's when people tend to report being able to see the future spontaneously. That's what they have. And anyway, they say whatever comes to mind. And then after that 30 minutes or so, we then randomly select a location after that. And then we get the participants to look at that location. So that's like their future event that's now happening. And then we see whether it matches up, to see whether what they said during the session before the location had even been chosen matched up with the location, the picture that we're showing them. And then we can analyze that. We can do a sort of statistical test and see whether that makes any difference. So we tested 40 people, 20 vegetarians and vegans, 20 meat eaters. This is all the procedure. I won't go through this again. And this is the sort of thing that people came up with, by the way. Or this is kind of the most startling things that people came up with. Someone would say, and this, remember, before the photograph has been shown, they would say, pink flower, lotus, millipede, aquatic, some kind of life form, a tuft of grass or sea anemone, blowing the breeze, looks purple, fish shapes, rushing water, and so on. And then you can see what it's actually, the actual target for them, if you like. The location was the Great Barrier Reef, which is really quite remarkable given what they said. We had no idea that picture would be chosen. And we had a few hits like that. I won't go through the other ones. But what we found was that, so the way you do it is that you get an independent judge to judge between 4 images. So they don't know which one's the right one. And you'd expect just by chance that people would just get 1 out of 4 right. So you're expecting a chance, 25% correct. What we actually found was that actually the meat eaters did quite badly. They only got 15% compared to 25%. Vegans and vegetarians combined got 40%. And the vegans alone got 47%, which is remarkable, really, much higher than you'd expect. Although, because it was quite a small sample, I have to stress this, because it was quite a small sample, it wasn't statistically significant. Although it was close to statistically significant. And also people who happened to be in the fasting state also did very well as well. I mean, I didn't ask people to fast, but some people just turned up and they happened to be in a fasting state, and they tended to do quite well as well. So that's it, really. That's really what I wanted to kind of go through. So if you want to get rid of those slides, we can just carry on talking if people want to ask questions about that or anything like that. It kind of gives you a bit more context about what I actually did over 3 years for my PhD.
Fascinating. I took part in a clinical research and ended up in a MRI trying to work with my mediumship, which was quite an interesting experience. But it's the understanding when you do these research, you're not out to prove or disprove something. You're there to present the facts. This is what we did, this is how we did it, and here's the results. So then it's on to people to take that forward. A lot of people, when I was doing this research up at King's College, was saying, well, did they prove it? And they're going, well, no, that's not their job. They're not there to prove that there is an afterlife. They're just there to gather all the information, bring the research together, and then present these papers. This is something that's quite not understood in the wider world, because people are looking for yes/no responses. We in spiritualism, we did have a history of working with a lot of scientists, and that seemed to have died out. And in some areas, there can be quite the resentment, because people misguidedly have this image that, oh, they're only trying to prove us wrong. And it's like, no, they're trying to find out how these things work, like how everything else works in the world. So it will be interesting to see the greater uptake in science looking at psychism, spiritualism, religion in general. We had a gentleman on, Jamie Aylward, from somewhere down there, Bristol way. But he went through the medical journal, the Lancet, and he put the key term search of spirituality in there like 10 years ago, and it returned something like 15 results. But the graph was really interesting because he did it for every year over a 10-year period, and it went from like 15 returns, so there's 15 articles in that year that mention the word spirituality, to something like 7,500. So it's there, you know, it is there. But as I say, we on our side, the spiritualist side, we need to understand that scientists are not out to disprove us. Scientists are not there to poo-poo us. Scientists are there to gather information, ensure that all the demands of the tests are met, that there's no or little or no room for mistakes to happen, and then just present the evidence. And that is it. So if anybody's got any questions out there or anything they want to share, please pop that in the chat box. Thoroughly enjoying this, Michael. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. I mean, I was going to say that I would have thought any scientist who wants to work with mediums must at least be kind of open to the possibility. I think scientists who think that there's nothing in it or it's all a load of rubbish are just, you know, kind of ignore you all. So I think, and I know that there's certainly my colleagues, I mean, I don't focus on mediumship. I mean, it's a part of what I look at. I mean, my focus really is on diet, well, and also on theories of consciousness. But certainly a lot of my colleagues at Northampton are very much more focused on mediumship and do quite a bit of work with the Arthur Findlay College and, you know, with mediums there. And my colleague, Professor Chris Rowe, has done sort of experimental work to check the accuracy really of mediums, and found that it does, you know, mediums do seem to be able to get more accurate readings than you'd expect by chance, which shows that something's going on. I mean, it doesn't necessarily show what's going on, but it does show something's going on.
Yes, very, very true. And there is, I mean, when we go back in history, science and religion did share the same platform. And we are going back thousands and thousands of years. But science evolved, science moved on, and science focused on the evidence of things, whereas religion then was reliant on the ruling party at the time of things. So we just saw this division come in and get more and more pronounced between the two fields. We have some exceptional workers within spirituality, that have something to share, something that could be looked at and could be understood. But as I say, in the general populace, people think, oh, scientists are just here to poo-poo us. Well, if we keep up that energy, then we risk damaging ourselves in the long run and not being, you know, taking up on yeah, okay, let's find out. You know, you want to do a survey, you want to do a test, fine, let's try it, see what happens.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more openness in the scientific community than you get the impression of if you kind of watch television, watch kind of mainstream TV, if you like, or listen to Radio 4 and so on, because they have a sort of baseline of being very skeptical, and not skeptical in a good way, but kind of skeptical in a bad way, of kind of like writing these things off. And unfortunately, some of the scientists who do that a lot seem to get the most airtime, really. And there's just a sort of presumption that this is, a bit like UFOs or other aspects, really. So there's a kind of quite a lot of prejudice, really, and they tend to interview scientists who just confirm that prejudice, and then everyone thinks that's the way it is. And unfortunately, that means that this topic is quite often taboo. And I think one of the things that's most special about what I do, and the fact that I do parapsychology as a living and do research, is that when I talk to people about it, it kind of gives them permission. I'm like a safe space for them. And people will quite often tell me stories of something that happened to them. So maybe some precognitive event or some remarkable telepathic event that happened to them. And they quite often they say, "No, I've never told anyone this before." And that's because they think they'll be laughed at, or ridiculed. And so, the fact that you do that, in your spiritualist churches, and you do that regularly and get together with like-minded people, it's there's a lot more openness out there, I think, than we're given the impression of.
Very true. Dr. Emily Currell is the lady that I was on her testing regime. I just had to look it up because it then started to annoy me. Jody Rabb here says Dr. Peter Fenwick was a neuropsychiatrist at King's who did a lot of fascinating research on near-death experiences. So that's, there is that research going on now, but as I say, sorry, from our side, from the spiritualist side, we need to start engaging intelligently and not talking to people and saying, well, of course, the parking fairy will make sure you've got somewhere to park your car. You know what I mean? Or we need to engage intelligently. We need to engage intelligently not only with the scientists, but also with the people coming into our churches and centres, because if we don't, we are risking potential for future. Sorry, hobby horse here.
No, and I mean, I'm also, I mean, it's my experience of, do you find people have unrealistic expectations sometimes of what they might, if people come to you as a punter, if you like, and ask for a reading, that they expect you to kind of come out with everything very precise and so on, and is it right that that's not the kind of way that this works, or would you say it does, or it should do?
No, you're quite right. It's a good question. You can come across that. Obviously we lose people on different levels. Every loss in our life is a different, separate, unique identity. And sometimes we're at a stage of our life we only want to hear from one person. Now, that person may or may not step forward, but from the mind of the medium, this is something I've been working on very much of late, is we have the communication from spirit, from the mind of spirit, through the mind of the medium to the mind of the sitter. Now, we're trying to translate an experience shared by spirit with the sitter. Now, unless we've got a lot of very common points of reference in our mind, this is where we can lose the thread a little bit. For instance, we had a gentleman on the platform and he kept saying he's holding a salmon. And the sitter was going, no, don't understand it. And then he got a bit personal, which it does do sometimes with mediums. I've got this salmon, I'm going to give it to you. And he said it about 3 times. And I said, what exactly have you got in your hand? He said, it's a fish. And the sitter went, well, his surname was Fish. So the mind of the medium has an effect, and this is something we need to work on and be more aware of. So yes, we can have people coming in wanting an exact connection and in a way that they are used to in the fashion of delivery from that spirit that's gone before. But it's got to go through the mind of the medium. And if there hasn't got the common points, I love engineers coming through because I used to work in an engineering firm. So if I have an engineer step forward, I'm in my element because I know what you're showing me. Oh, it's a slover nut. I know that.
Yeah.
Had I not had that experience, I'd be going, I haven't got a clue what you're showing me.
Yeah, and that's what I find when I do these precognitive experiments, because you're asking people to just say whatever's come to their mind, and imagery and so on, and then you see the location, and sometimes you show them the participant the location, and you realize that what the mind has done is made a few leaps. So for example, the target was for one of my participants was I can't remember, was it Kilimanjaro? No, not Kilimanjaro. What's the name of the famous volcano in Japan?
Fiji.
No, it's not. Is it
Mount Fiji?
Mount Fiji. Yeah. That still doesn't sound quite right, but maybe that's just me. Anyway, what they said was during the session they were talking about, I feel like I can see a rim, or I'm in a canyon, and when I actually showed them the photograph, they went, I was in the crater at the top, and it kind of immediately made sense for them. But what they'd said, for someone who's not been there, they knew it as soon as they saw the picture. That's exactly what my mind did. But we're kind of expecting someone to just come out with, I can see a mountain and I can see a lake in front of it, because that's what the picture showed. But as soon as your sort of psychic sense got a sense of, they got a sense of that picture, but it's not the same as a visual sense of that picture, and that's the difficulty. And I think in mediumship, I'm guessing it's possibly a similar problem, like you were saying there. It's kind of symbolic sometimes, and if you can't interpret the symbols correctly, and how do you know if you're interpreting the symbols correctly? Because you're just making an interpretation. Then it can be hard, and so I can understand why it's difficult.
Well, this is it. I did an interest, just a little off the cuff experiment with one of my circles, and I gave them 3 bits of evidence, and I said, write a message based around those 3 pieces of evidence. And you got 3 very, very different stories containing those bits of evidence, but presented in different ways. And it does, because our mind is logical. Our mind wants to narrate the story. So if I said to you, egg, duck, and pond, you're there with a duck pond, in the middle with a duck island and eggs, because we want that story. And this is, I think, sometimes gets in our way. Mount Fuji, I just had to look it up.
Yes. For some reason, that still doesn't sound right, but it's not like I'm disbelieving it. It's just, I don't know. It's because it's getting late, I get it on a Saturday evening.
So we have Stephen Mager, and he's asking, did you notice any remarkable incidents of dietary intuition where someone had been drawn to a diet that was appropriate for a condition they went on to have diagnosed? So he's talking there, I think, as a precognitive, so you may have given up roughage and then found out that there was a condition with the colon which roughage would have exacerbated.
I haven't, no.
Easy. There you go.
I mean, but I will say some of my participants, I will say, so there's a sort of presumption, I haven't really made this clear, but I think when I started doing this research, and perhaps the way I've talked about it as well, there's a sort of presumption that if you stop eating meat, or if you start fasting, then somehow you will become more psychic or more spiritual. I think the more people I've talked to about this, the more people who've kind of told me that it's almost the other way around, that sometimes people will have had a kind of spiritual opening or a sort of psychic opening, and then afterwards they feel that they can't eat meat anymore. It becomes disgusting to them, or they actually develop a physical intolerance to it. So it's kind of that way. It's almost like it's the other way around. It's not like that, you stop eating meat, you become more psychic, but it's like you become more psychic and then you can't tolerate meat, and you need to fast, that kind of thing. So it's a kind of, I was going to say chicken and egg, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's possibly the causal, if there is a causal relationship, then it's quite possibly the other way around, the way I thought it might be when I started off doing the research. So I know that's not answering that question, but because that's because I don't really have an answer to that question. It did prompt that thought. So hopefully that's of interest.
Yeah. And it is very interesting, isn't it? I'm not going to eat, we do spend an awful lot of time chasing things, don't we? So going on tonight's topic, you could very quickly formulate the opinion, all right, well, if I fast for 3 days, I'm going to become a better medium. But actually, when we're talking about bringing stuff back to self all the time, it doesn't matter if you fast 3 days, 10 days, or not at all, because it comes back to the intent, the person, and the platform from which they are working on to present themselves to the outside world. We do see, and unfortunately we do see this quite a lot within spiritualism, of people chasing an ideal, people wanting, I want to be a medium. And when you ask them why, they've got absolutely no idea, because it may mask what they feel are inadequacies in themselves. It may think, some people think you're going to be really rich being a medium. Well, tell me when that happens, please, somebody.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But yeah, it is about coming back to self. And again, this transcends our topic tonight of psychism and spirituality. It's about your health, to put you in a place fit to go out of the door and live the life that this world demands today. Fascinating. Dr. Dorr, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for asking me.
No,
it's been a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. I really, really enjoyed that. Oh, hold on. There is a comment here. Geraldine, I love Geraldine. She's great fun, but we are going to fall out on this one. BBC did a program recently, and the woman who is doing a so-called research very biased against mediumship. It goes on to say, in their opinion, she made fun of Helen Duncan's family and other well-known physical medium. This is going back to the topic we were talking about scientists. We have this image, they're trying to debunk us all the time. I remember this program well. There were parts in it which were for television, but there were also elements in there, I must admit, where this lady doing the presenting really showed interest in things. We can sometimes be in our emotional body on things, and it's the same when we talk about science and spiritualism. This instant reaction of, they're trying to debunk us, they're taking a mickey out of us, often can be very unfounded, or just based on one very negative experience and not taken in the light of everything. But yeah, thank you, Geraldine, for putting that in there. As I say, yes, there were parts in that program I found distasteful, but there were parts when I saw the humanity in this lady's presentation. I thought it was rather beautiful. In fact, we might have her on one night. That would be wonderful. So play nice, Geraldine. Anyway, Dr. Dorr, thank you so much for tonight. Been really interesting. Good luck with your research. If you come up with another paper and you need participants, please drop me a link to that, and I'd love to share that out. I know some wonderful people that will enter into research willingly and with an open mind.
Well, thank you. I might very well take you up on that, Lawrence. That's because, as I said, I would like to do a survey around mediumship and diet. So you'll hear from me later this year, hopefully.
Absolutely brilliant. I want to refer back to one of your wonderful slides where it said about gastrointestinal issues. It is such a common thing when mediums are getting up to work. They go, oh, my stomach's churning. Oh my God, my stomach. Now, we've always appended that to the chakra activity. But is this also a physical diet thing? That would be interesting to find out. Have they sat in the car and eaten about 10 Kit Kats before they come out?
Yes.
Anyway, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight and listening, and those people watching on catch up or on the podcast later. Welcome, welcome, welcome. You can remember you can see a church service from our church every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. and we have Anna Maria Walton from Edinburgh with us tomorrow. So in the meantime, sir, thank you so much. It's always such a gift when people just share their time, their energy and their knowledge with us, and it's much appreciated. And next week we have Chris Jacobs with us to take our Lyceum evening. But thank you. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening, Mike.
Thank you, and you.